Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for coming along. My name is Roz. I work at the University of Edinburgh. My co-presenter Anne works at the University of St Andrews. We have a webinar today for you that's about evaluation. It's about research culture, and it's about finding your way when research culture evaluation needs to happen now in real-world complex project circumstances unfolding around you. We're drawing for our experience working in and evaluating InFrame, a 2-year Wellcome-funded collaborative research culture project based across the universities of Glasgow, St Andrews and Edinburgh. Our talk is also about coming up against challenges and responding with flexibility, creative pivots, joyful practices, not because this is easy, but because it does something important. We understand these creative pivots as a wayfinding process, as evaluation strategy, as methodology. You might see here that we have retitled our talk slightly to emphasize wayfinding rather than a blueprint, but the gist of the talk remains the same. So this is very much a how talk process, not yet the destination of evaluation outcomes. And our talk builds on a much shorter talk we gave at the REDS conference in January. So we'll talk for about 40 minutes, then open to questions and finish up at 11 a.m. We hope this speaks to many of you because we know the challenges we face are not unique, and there will be many intersecting insights in the room today.
Great. So before we get into the evaluation journey per se, we'll just take a bit of time to orient in the landscape. We'll first give you a bit of a sense of where we're coming from in terms of our backgrounds and how we came to this work. We'll then present what we mean by scruffy hospitality, which is one of the leading themes for this presentation. And we'll say something about the stakes of research culture evaluation as we see them. We'll then take a bit of time to zoom in into some more practical things, sketching out the emerging landscape of evaluation approaches as we're seeing it from our perspective and what we see as some of the main shared practical challenges. Now pass back to Roz.
So welcome to my squiggly career path. We're showing these first to highlight that there are so many valid ways into this kind of work. It's also part of our qualitative practice to highlight the positions we come from that affect what we can see and do, and also what we can't. My path is one across disciplines and different parts of the sector. I began where I felt comfortable in the sciences. I had some real privileges encountering platypus chromosomes and coral nervous systems. But even then, I was so curious about social and cultural aspects of science, the joy, the eccentricity, and also how much research environments often seem to cost people. That's the thread still running through my career. I explored this by working in open publishing. I retrained in social studies of science and had to reconstruct my view of the world. And a PhD in postdoc allowed me to interview scientists about openness, which became conversations about culture, making really vivid to me the wide range of environments from inspiring to harmful. I wanted to tackle it on a funding and policy level, and I got the chance to do that at Wellcome for a while. And as I come into InFrame, I still hold research culture as my mission, which I know is naive, and evaluation as my way of working.
My own squiggly career path started in sociology. There I was really interested in the politics of knowledge and feminist epistemology, so questions around who can speak and how, whose knowledge is legitimate, how credibility is constructed, with what consequence on what it's possible to do. I followed those questions into gender studies and the critical humanities, and later on into a social science PhD, with a bit of a detour in the middle, researching the potential impacts of AI on the future of creative work. My doctoral work is about the uses of evidence in policy making, specifically around equalities policy. And in more recent years, the squiggly path has taken me into some evaluation work in the third sector, and also some work that I used to file under academic service, but I now think of as research culture work. So work around bullying, tackling bullying and harassment in universities, and a lot of access mentoring, mostly around postgraduate entry. InFrame is my first role explicitly focused on research culture, but in many ways it feels like a natural extension of a number of interests and commitments that I've had for a long time. So that's for my squiggly path.
Bringing these together, you can see how we've come from different backgrounds, but with overlaps that we find productive. We have two different kinds of qualitative interdisciplinary background, which lends an openness to combining and mashing up methods in creative ways. We're now both in research professional services, having left higher education a few times only to find ourselves coming back to it. We're on precarious contracts, we're perhaps early career, we're products of our lived experiences in research culture. This leads us to the type of work we're talking about today, which feels like responding from first principles, beyond a single organisational paradigm or profession, and stepping outside the norms of our disciplinary homes, even as we're influenced by them. We're engaged in a kind of active, practice-based work of doing culture change supported by research skills, and we see evaluation as learning.
Which brings us to scruffy hospitality. So from the beginning, we felt it would be really important to be open about the messiness of the work because of this commitment to evaluation as learning. However, we do work in contexts where it tends to be the case that there are perverse incentives that encourage performing success. In that context, it can be quite hard to be open about the mess and not already having found all the right answers. And it's something that we're not immune to ourselves, and this is why we've been trying to find ways out of this. This is in the lower left-hand corner. This is Oliver Burkeman. He does gentle writing for overthinkers and perfectionists. And he draws from others as well as his own observations to talk about that urge that we can get to put on a show when we host for other people, to hide the mess, to make it tidy, make it look better than what it actually looks like most of the time. And how that kind of performance is really a barrier to connecting with other people. And for us, a barrier to collaboration. So he suggests one way out of this is to call off the whole performance, show people what's really going on, which might feel risky, but also potentially pay off. And that idea of calling off the whole performance ended up being a really important reminder for us and an important orientation in the work, because it helped us protect the kind of openness and curiosity and joy that we need to be able to do the work under pressured circumstances. It also helped us facilitate spaces for other people in a more open way. And it helped us think about accessibility, about what we and others might need to be able to fully participate in research culture work and conversations. So we're continuously trying to experiment with this and bring it into the work. And you might see that happen in different ways in the talk, including through amateur PowerPoint art or this Teams background that we made for digital evaluation activities. But for our purposes today, it's centrally about not feeling completely incapacitated by the stakes of the work, which Roz will tell you a bit more about now.
So why would research culture evaluation work feel high stakes to the people engaged in it? First, we know that the lived experience stakes of research culture itself are tangibly high. We know this from ourselves, those around us, participants in our studies, reporting in the sector. We know there's a large amount of precarity, struggle, and inequality in a kind of nexus of overlapping problems. It was highlighted in the 2020 Wellcome Research Culture Report, with the director at the time describing it as a shocking portrait of the research environment. So it's a crisis of human experience in our institutions. In a way, those are the stakes. At the same time, there are some other high stakes that are very apparent now in our institutions. We're at a particularly acute time across sector instability and pressure, a crisis with a financial framing that affects our workforce on a large scale. And of course, these two things aren't really separate, but part of a melee of experience at the moment. And this interacts with research culture evaluation. What does that interaction feel like? This is one way of showing it. This is a visual that came about through a conversation with my colleague Katie Nicol-Baines. We were discussing how for evaluation, both of research culture and related equality, diversity and inclusion work, there can be a perverse systems level incentive to show progress and positive evidence while still in the exploration phase of what works. Urgency and resource limits are common or normalized. There is a sense that in these areas of work, we need to prove our worth rather than being taken as essential areas to invest in. It feels like any evaluation evidence could be used to adjudicate the value of our areas of endeavour as a whole, rather than one specific exploration. This constrains the space that exists to do brave, important work and to rigorously, fearlessly evaluate it. The point of naming these stakes and their constraining effects is to remember, oh, we seem to be in a small box. Perhaps the box is not inevitable. Perhaps it could be otherwise. There are spaces outside the box, and we have to think and work critically and creatively so that our actions and decisions aren't all products of this constrained space, so that we can open up space for others rather than reinforcing the walls of the box.
And this work of imagining otherwise also has a politics to it. So in many ways, research culture work connects with struggles towards equity and justice in our institutions. So struggles against institutional racism, against misogyny, queerphobia and transphobia, against ableism and classism in our institutions. It also connects with work resisting and tracing the impacts of neoliberalization and marketization in our institutions. And in our own work, we're learning a lot from folks working to make these links explicit. So for instance, people like Jess Adams and Will Thompson, who last year facilitated a conversation exploring research culture as a movement, and people like Emily Ennis and the co-organizers of the Politics of Research Culture Working Group, and the many excellent people who are developing that community in that line of work. Next slide, please. So that's broadly what we wanted to put on the map for you in terms of the big picture. And now we'll say a few things about evaluation approaches and challenges in the space.
So we're arriving into wayfinding and the terrain of designing an evaluation strategy. And maybe we're arriving in different ways at different scales. Others in this room might be working at a sector level, considering REF, for example. You might be working at an institutional level or on an action plan. Some of us might be working on a project or single initiative, and we'll now begin to address the project level where we're working more directly. One of the challenges is that there is no single correct evaluation strategy for a project, as several colleagues across the sector have observed. It's about making justified design choices. Some choices are simpler than others. For a straightforward initiative that's been piloted before, there might be a clear methodological choice. But research culture projects are often complex, multi-part, ambitious, and experimental. This slide gestures to wayfinding we see happening around us. These are straw people approaches rather than being actual projects, but they represent a range. This range of paths show how different our contexts are and the different approaches we need to take to them, but also the unsettled nature of this terrain. We're in the process of figuring this out, and perhaps we can talk about that. A brief signpost before we dive our way into wayfinding. Here are some navigational challenges to look out for. Perhaps they will be familiar and they will become relevant along the way. They are that high demand and stakes around research culture evaluation that can lead to perverse incentives, short timelines for evaluating impact, especially culture impact, being nested in the context we're working to change. If we're embedded in a project, we have the advantage of an inside view, but it comes with complex dynamics. Needing an approach that can make sense of culture change, change resistance, and the way institutions work. And the expertise in knowledge politics that come with evaluation, an area that brings so many professions, approaches, and skills to the table, shaping what we see as valid evidence. And before we start, we also want to acknowledge that there's an increasingly vibrant space of discussion and collective endeavour happening in different groups around research culture evaluation. At the moment, it's increasing, and thinking about navigating these kinds of challenges. So we hope we can add this wayfinding to this conversation as a contribution, not as an endpoint.
So we're coming to the main part of the presentation, where we're sharing our own evaluation journey. And we'll tell you the story of this in 5 pivots. And by pivots, we mean moments when we ran into a problem and had to take a decision or had to find a creative way through. And to provide some grounding context, Ros will start by giving you an overview of the InFrame project as the setting for this journey.
So here are some structural features of our project. You don't have to take in all the detail. I'll pull out some highlights. It is complex and multi-layered. There are many levels to evaluate on. Well, 3 levels at least. It's a collaboration of 3 institutions. It has 3 work packages running across all 3. We have funded 26 projects as part of this, and much of our team works closely with those projects. Our team of about 21 currently is mostly newly hired for the project, and there's a turnover related to fixed-term contracts. We are diverse in backgrounds, expertise, ways of working, and positions in our institutions. One of our work packages involves scaling up a project, the People Make Research Recognition Project at the University of Glasgow, but our overarching aims are experimental and involve capacity in responding flexibly to environments we're discovering and the people and projects we're supporting. The first creative pivot is how we went from evaluation as a one-person job embedded in this structure to a collaboration at a strategy level, which was the first step to making evaluation participative in a wider sense. As the embedded evaluation manager, I found myself here in this cartoon, clutching my draft evaluation strategy and the ticking time bomb of a project deadline, with lots of ideas of what to do, but no way to get them done without becoming a bottleneck in the process. I could have chosen to linearly, hierarchically delegate evaluation tasks across the team, but this would be slow and it would treat the team as blank slates, not benefiting from the ideas and energy they wanted to bring and the things they were already working on. I found myself saying early on that evaluation would need to be collaborative, but in truth, I didn't yet see how to do this fast enough to match the timescale. I needed critical friendship within the strategy tent of evaluation, not just for implementation. I was on the point of seeking an external advisor for a few sessions, which is something I'd still recommend if you find yourself in a situation like that. But a pivot arrived when I realized that some of my colleagues brought a specific capacity and drive for the combined methodological and relational work of evaluation strategy. And Anne was one of those colleagues, arriving into the project after several months in a different institution to me with ambitions to do meta research at an overarching level of the project, unknowingly at the time overlapping with evaluation. So we began to talk about how this was a common challenge. Lots of analysis, research, and reflection activities within the team overlapped with the remit of evaluation. And the relational challenge was this work really mattered to all of us, and we risked stepping on each other's toes. Anne and I prepared a presentation for the team that featured the metaphor of the cat dog, representing research and evaluation, where activities can be similar but purposes are different. We took it to small groups using homemade slides like this one, and we listened. And it was the beginning of increased transparency and a type of psychological safety. In retrospect, collaborating at a strategy level was essential. Its key methodological effect was tackling a problem that we call partial sight lines, only being able to see what's going on in the project to a limited extent with cross-institutional working. We've also crossed hierarchies, preventing collapse into simplified top-down or bottom-up perspectives. It amplified our connections across the team and capacity to work in a more participative way. And it developed a more confident voice for evaluation, crucial when the stakes feel high and when offering any degree of challenge or novelty from an internal position. Now I will draw a breath and move to pivot 2. The first pivot made the huge task of evaluation seem possible, and it opened the door to participative practice. Pivot 2 was then creating spaces that feel different. This speaks to the challenge of being nested in with the research cultures we aim to transform, or using a metaphor that Richard Greenham shared with us, being a fish in the bowl trying to change the water while we're still in the bowl. Everyone in our team and the projects we fund is learning valuable things about how InFrame is working, which is rich evaluation evidence. Our team members are frontline witnesses and participants in culture change with different sightlines, often in uniquely embedded positions. But it was initially hard to find spaces where it felt inspiring and safe and productive to share these stories. Not everyone will speak up in the same room. This isn't problematic, it's how people work, especially with any kind of power dynamic. For example, it's a consideration in focus group design. It's not only about who might want to hold back sensitive information, it's about what people come to realize or feel inspired to say because of the environment they're in or the people around them. We began with an initial workshop just for team members with frontline roles, shaped by facilitation expertise within the team. Since then, we've adapted it for different roles and hierarchies. We've called it a working session, a retreat, or an evaluation cabin. An evaluation cabin has stuck. It can be in-person, online, group, individual, long or short, depending on what the participants need. What are the elements that make it work? So first, actually changing the physical environment, if only for a moment, replacing that castle in the fishbowl, going to a different building or room, playing music. Physical reminders that this is different, including here, Anne's picnic blanket. Adding playful, silly Teams backgrounds for online. Changing the environment is also psychological. The style of facilitation matters, bringing playfulness and joy in different ways. It can't guarantee psychological safety, but it lowers the waterline in the language of Lewis Deep Democracy, an approach introduced by Francesca, one of our leadership developers. Some of the facilitation techniques we keep coming back to are from Lewis Deep Democracy, including the check-in, participative decision-making, and looking for the no, being aware that it can be hard to raise a dissenting voice. We also provide structure, something to respond to, a question or story, and that brings us to pivot 3.
Pivot 3 is then about how we started formalizing a methodology, because we're bringing together all of these different perspectives and kinds of evidence, and then the question was, how do we turn this into a coherent form of reporting? So we call our methodology qualitative-led. In practice, it's mixed methods. It does involve quantitative data and different kinds of evidence, but it is led by qualitative sensibilities and methodologies. So what does that mean in practice? I'll just sort of pull a few elements for you here. Next slide, please. The first thing is that it means taking stories seriously. So stories, experiences, feelings, even, and maybe most importantly, complaints after Sarah Ahmed's work on institutional change. These are all forms of data about culture and about how our systems and institutions work. And working qualitatively means that we can link individual instances and experiences to broader systems, understand them as symptoms of larger dynamics. So this is a screenshot on the slide of a prompt that we often use to open the evaluation cabin, where we ask people what stories they would most like to tell about their work on the project from their unique perspective. So that's one way in which we center stories in the evaluation and bring that metaphor and that frame into the data collection that we do. Next slide, please. Working qualitatively also means making links between an intervention and then the institution that it's being developed in, putting the institution itself back inside the frame. One way of doing this is thinking about how, sociologically speaking, an institution is a structure that is built to reproduce outcomes, regardless of individual action. So in other words, the core function of an institution is to resist change. So change efforts can't be understood outside of their relationship to institutional dynamics and institutional resistance. That gives us a frame for thinking about things that don't work, about quote unquote failure. Because if institutions are built to resist change, then failure is one kind of expected outcome, not in a fatalist way, but in the sense that it's a really informative kind of finding to explore and report on, because it tells us more about our contexts and how they work. Next slide, please. And we've brought this explicitly into our reporting strategy. So this is a slide from an update to our team about the evaluation methodology a few months back, where we were describing what the reporting will cover. And that would be documenting what we did do, what we might have improved, any takeaway lessons, and also where we might have reproduced the negative culture dynamics that we're trying to change. So knowing that we don't operate in a vacuum, putting the institution itself back inside the frame can help us better understand what's going on. Next slide, please. This is another element that I'm pulling out from the methodology, which is around aligning our strategy for analysis with how we know culture works. So culture is always contested, it's multiple, it's not monolithic. In our project, we're working with multiple coexisting and often competing values, ways of working, theories about what's needed for research culture change work. So we need a strategy for analysis that doesn't flatten all of these differences, that's built for pluralism, that assumes some baseline amount of disagreement. And the strategy that we're taking is called crystallization. It's sort of a methodological take on what rigorous qualitative work can look like. And it allows multiple standpoints to be brought together to generate this big picture with many facets, not assuming a single ground truth, but putting together this big complex picture. And part of what makes this more possible is working in that way that is sensitive to power dynamics, as Ros was talking about in terms of the evaluation cabin. So we do get those different perspectives and kinds of contradicting evidence. Next slide, please. Now, we may be wondering whether this actually counts as a pivot, because we did tell you that we came in as qualitative people and we ended up doing a qualitative strategy. So how is that a change? The pivot here was around being aware that qualitative work is often mischaracterized as fluffy, anecdotal, not about outcomes, not rigorous, the thing you do when you don't have the numbers, this kind of thing. Even as qualitative approaches are uniquely suitable for understanding research culture, and even as they generate distinct forms of evidence that complement, expand, and often challenge quantitative approaches. So we knew that in some places our approach would face some resistance and would need to be advocated for, that there would be some amount of normalized pressure to produce a kind of reporting that's already in the language of the institutionally powerful, and that the value for evaluation reporting to do the work of trying to find meaningful ways to represent experiences of culture on the ground and experiences of change work in our projects and our institutions might not immediately be clear, that it would need to be proven in some way. And so the pivot was knowing that this would happen and committing to this strategy anyway. And of course, this translation and advocacy work is something that we're all engaged in various ways in this space as we try to use evidence to make our institutions better. Next slide, please. The final thing that we wanted to highlight is that this kind of work does require a high degree of additional care and effort behind the scenes. So we are holding an enormous amount of sensitive information, and that requires additional care to manage in an ethical and confidential way, both relationally and in terms of information management. So that is a significant and often not very visible part of our work. So that's for pivot 3. And I will pass back on to Ros for pivot 4.
Thank you. So pivot 4 is snowballing. This is a bit of a palette cleanser. It's a simple concept. It's borrowed from qualitative methods, an incremental way of working adaptable to many contexts. Pivot 4 is the response to several challenges, including that feeling of high stakes around research culture evaluation and having a short timeline to work with. Although by this point we have a collaboration, we have a participative practice, a qualitative led methodology for our culture context, this is still a huge ask for 2 people to manage without panicking. Snowballing is a pivot because it involves seeing a huge challenge or only being able to see one step ahead and responding by lowering the stakes. Doing the tiniest version of something difficult as early as possible to learn from it, then iterating. Snowballing is a way of working that we come back to repeatedly when faced with uncertainty. Evaluation cabins started in this way with one experiment. Another key example is evaluation reporting, the main output for us at the end of the project. We began visualizing the structure of the evaluation report as early as possible. Last December, it took the form of a title page and a table of contents, a digest of the main stories of the project that we heard from different perspectives, and iteratively restructured it as we shared it with people in evaluation cabins. And that's still part of the process. We're still iterating on it now as we bring the report together. Back to Anne.
And that brings us to our last pivot, which is about how we're generating robust findings within the project timeframe by creating what we're calling a qualitative baseline. So this slide visualizes the life cycle of a project from the original idea on the left and proposal through to the initiative and its impacts. Next slide, please. Now, traditionally, evaluation is outcome focused, it's future oriented, so it starts here in the middle and it's looking over to the right, looking for these post-initiative impacts. But for us as a fixed term project, our resourcing timeline here in purple ends with the project, so we don't have access to this part of the space and will not cost it to be there to see it. In a way, it was a real sticky moment for us because the traditional framing of evaluation leans so heavily towards capturing impacts in the longer term. We had to really think, how could we evaluate what hadn't happened yet? And if we couldn't do that, then what could we do in a rigorous way within the timeline? And could we just commit to doing something a bit different, working with what we do have? What we did have is access to a lot of knowledge about the starting points of the project. Next slide, please. So what we could do and did end up doing is to shift the focus of the evaluation to include these parts on the left. So that's bringing in all the institutional history of the project inside the evaluation, the initial context, the early design decisions, the early trade-offs, as well as documenting the setup and implementation phases. So by documenting our own starting point, we can create a meaningful internal point of comparison for evaluating change within our timeline. And we also make it more possible to extrapolate findings beyond our own context, because we're clearer about what role or structure might have played in our outcomes, potentially facilitating more contrast and comparison with other institutions that might be structured differently. Next slide, please. In concrete terms, we've used this to structure our evaluation report. So for each work package that we're evaluating, we're investigating the origin story by gathering these reflections about the decisions that shape the project proposal. We're documenting the theory of change for each strand, so how it was anticipated that that strand would create impact. We're documenting what actually happened in practice when the ideas from the proposal were implemented in the project. And these sections give some grounding and some anchor points for the evaluation part that we end up doing after that. So to just recap, this qualitative baseline strategy works by creating a reference point that's inside the timeline of the project so that we have something to compare against in a rigorous way, and we can use the data that we have in a resource flexible way. So that's for pivot 5. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we've come to the end of the journey so far. It's still ongoing. We had a few more pivot than would fit in the talk, but the gist of it is that we made evaluation collaborative, which helped make it participative. We created spaces that felt different. We committed to qualitative-led evaluation. We snowballed, and we created a qualitative baseline. Now, it's really satisfying to say the story in one go, like it all happened seamlessly in a calm and collected manner, which it didn't. It felt more like a series of tiny moves taken in the dark, not knowing whether it would pay off, moments where the context demanded a response from us and we just made a call and had to see what happened. In the end, we did get somewhere, and with a bit of distance, we can see some core shared features to all of these pivots. And we've tried from that to articulate a set of principles that have guided our evaluation work so far. So the principles are, here on the slides, adopting a qualitative-led mixed method approach, working in a pluralistic way, in a way that's sensitive to cultures of research culture, working in participative ways that are sensitive to power, and working in a distributed, resource-flexible, opportunistic, and joyful way, making the most of imperfect circumstances. And under these principles, you might recognize some of the elements of the pivots that we were just presenting. I won't read them out. I'll just pause for a second to let you take it in. So this is how it connects. The principles connect to our journey so far. They also speak back to some of the earlier challenges that Ross mentioned in our introduction.
So as we bring these elements together in a potentially unnavigable slide, we're moving towards the kind of blueprint-like structure we had in mind when we named the presentation, the original title of the talk. Perhaps this begins to be a takeaway slide that summarizes what we've learned that could be more widely useful. But there is a reason we chose wayfinding instead. We now come back to the words of Oliver Berkman, who we cited earlier with Scruffy Hospitality, who's our unlikely guru of research culture evaluation. He says, offering a list of steps to implement almost never works, since they ignore the internal journey the author had to take to arrive at them. He talks about perspective shifts, the small insights that sink in slowly and persist in unlikely ways. So with that, we invite you to take anything that resonated in this wayfinding and leave the rest. We also want to acknowledge that if you're doing research culture evaluation, your journey might look very different to us, coming from a different place, going through different pivots, arriving at different principles. But there are also perhaps many of us traveling in parallel, increasingly in community. As collective work continues on research culture evaluation, we hope this talk can be an invitation to share the processes you've gone through, the pivots you've made that work for your context, even if they seem a bit radical and difficult to say out loud, and the principles that might travel.
All that's left is for me to bring the presentation to a close. Thank you so much for your attention. We will stop the recording now and open the floor for questions.